Nora Hill signed her name on the contract without reading the last page, not because she hadn't been warned. The solicitor had cleared his throat twice and pushed the document closer to her across the mahogany desk. The way men do when they want a woman to feel the weight of what she's agreeing to. She felt it. She simply didn't need to read it to know what it said. Every woman who worked in the county's poorhouses and sick rooms knew what it said. Marry the Duke of Hamilton. Accept the payment. Stay until the end. Deed at the end, in this case, was not expected to be far off. She signed anyway. Set the pen down. Folded her hands in her lap, the solicitor looked at her the way people look at something they can't quite categorize. Miss Hill, he said carefully. You understand the Duke has not received visitors in 3 years. The last 11 women who were engaged under similar arrangements. How long did the longest one stay? A pause. 3 days, and the shortest. She left before the carriage had fully stopped. Nora picked up her gloves from the desk. I'm not here to visit, she said. I'm here because no man should die still believing he's a murderer, and no one has bothered to stay long enough to tell him otherwise. The solicitor stared at her. She stood. Tucked the gloves under her arm, and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. No one should die alone with a verdict that was never properly tried. She said. That's all. She left before he could find an answer. What she hadn't told him, what she hadn't told anyone, was the other reason. She'd learned about it the way she learned most things, through a letter. Her father's annual letter, arriving every year on the 1st of October without fail. Always the same stiff handwriting, always the same careful distance, always the same final line. Your mother would have been 43 this year. She was in excellent health before you were born. That he never said it directly. Had never needed to. 23 years of October letters had done the work just as thoroughly as if Head carved it into the kitchen table. You came into the world and took someone out of it, and the accounting has never balanced. Nora had spent 14 years doing the math herself. She'd sat with dying men and women in 3 different counties. She'd held hands at the end of fevers, at the end of long illnesses. At the end of things that had no good name. She'd told herself each time that this was useful work, honest work, work that justified the column she'd been entered in at birth on the wrong side of the ledger. She'd believed that. Mostly, then the notice had come. A duke. A man who had locked himself in his rooms for 3 years because he believed himself responsible for his father's death. A man who had stopped eating properly, stopped receiving visitors. Stopped by all available evidence seeing any reason to continue the considerable effort of being alive. Nora had read the notice twice. Then she'd written to the solicitor. She wasn't certain it was courage. It might have been recognition. The driver stopped the carriage half a mile from the gate. This is as far as I go, he said, without looking back at her. Nora considered arguing. The sky was the color of old pewter, and the November wind had teeth in it. She looked at the iron gate at the end of the gravel road, half hidden by overgrown hedgerows. And decided arguing would cost more time than it was worth. She gathered her bag and stepped down without assistance. The driver turned the carriage around before she'd taken 10 steps. She walked. The grounds of Blackstone Hall had been beautiful once she could see the architecture of it beneath. The neglect, the way a good face shows through illness. Formal gardens flanked both sides of the drive, but the roses had been left to go wild for at least 2 seasons, canes arching into the path. Some broken and hanging at angles that made the whole border look like something mid-collapse. The oak trees were bare and enormous, throwing no shadows on a shadowless day. The house itself rose at the end of the drive in gray stone, 3 stories, symmetrical. The kind of house that had been built to last several centuries and seemed determined to accomplish this with or without anyone's help. Every window on the upper floors was dark. The gate was unlocked. She let herself through. A man was waiting at the front door. He was perhaps 60. Thin in the way of people who have been thinned by years rather than appetite, with the careful expressionless face of a servant who has learned to reveal nothing as a matter of professional survival. Miss Hill. He said that I am Marsh. I manage the household. He stepped back to let her enter. The entrance hall was large and cold and smelled of stone and old wood fires and something underneath those things that she couldn't quite name, the particular quality of air in places where people have been unhappy for a long time. "I'll show you to your room," Marsh said. "And then to his Grace's corridor." "His corridor, he doesn't come out of it." Marsh said this the way one states a geographical fact. "The East Corridor. Second floor. His rooms are at the end." He took her bag before she could object and started toward the staircase. Nora followed. "How many before me?" 11. A pause. "The most recent stayed 3 days. That was the longest. What ended it?" Marsh was quiet for a moment. They reached the top of the stairs and turned east. The corridor stretched ahead of them, lit by 2 wall sconces that threw more shadow than light. That he spoke to her on the second day. Marsh said finally. "She came down afterward. She didn't finish her dinner. She left before breakfast the following morning." "What did he say to her?" Another pause. "Longer this time that I don't know exactly. But she was crying when she came downstairs. And she'd arrived quite confident she wouldn't be." Nora absorbed that. They stopped outside a heavy oak door at the corridor's end. Everything was quiet. She had stayed in sick rooms enough to know the particular quality of silence that exists around a person who has decided to stop, not the peace of rest, but the held breath quality of a space waiting for something that wasn't coming. This silence had that quality that he knows you're coming. She asked that he was informed. Marsh set her bag down outside her room, the door adjacent to his. He made no response either way. "All right." Marsh looked at her for a moment with an expression that might, in better light, have been something close to pity. "Miss Hill," he said. "If you need anything during the night, it'll be fine." She looked at the door at the end of the hall. Dark wood, iron handle, the faint line of light visible underneath it. Someone had a lamp on. "What time does he usually sleep?" "I don't believe he does." "Not reliably." She nodded. "Thank you." Marsh thought he left. She stood in the corridor a moment longer, looking at the thin line of light under the door. Then she went into her own room, unpacked what she needed for the night, and sat on the edge of the bed. Outside, the wind moved through the bare oaks and the house settled around her. And somewhere at the end of the corridor a man who had not left his rooms in 3 years sat behind a locked door and waited for whatever was going to happen next, she thought. He's still waiting. That meant something. She wasn't sure yet how much. She knocked at 7 in the morning, not the careful, apologetic knock she'd heard Marsh use on her way past the corridor the night before. 2 soft taps. The kind that already contained their own withdrawal. She knocked the way she knocked on every door she'd ever needed to open, 3 times, evenly spaced. With enough weight behind them to be heard by someone who was trying not to hear. Silence. She knocked again. "Your Grace. My name is Nora Hill. I arrived yesterday evening. Your solicitor has told me something of your circumstances, and I'd like to speak with you directly. If you're willing." "Nothing, I'll wait," she said. She was not, in any comfortable sense, willing to wait. The corridor was cold and the wall sconce nearest her had burned out sometime in the night. And she was aware that she had been awake since 5 and had eaten nothing since the previous afternoon. But she had said it as though she meant it, so she stood there, and she counted, and she waited. At 6 minutes, she heard movement. It was not the movement of a sick man, not the careful, rationed shuffle of someone managing pain. It was deliberate. Measured. The movement of someone who had learned to be precise about how he spent himself, which was a different thing entirely. The bolt slid back, the door opened. Guy Hamilton, the 8th Duke of Hamilton, stood in the doorway. And Nora looked at him with the same expression she used for everything that required careful looking, steady, open, giving nothing away before she'd taken inventory. He had been, she could see, a very tall man before whatever combination of injury and long disuse had taught his body to brace itself. He was still tall, had to drop his chin slightly to meet her eyes, but he held himself the way buildings hold themselves after a partial collapse, the structure intact. The weight redistributed, everything load-bearing, working harder than it was built to. A carved walking stick in his right hand, his weight settled into it with the ease of long habit. Dark hair, uncut by several months' reckoning. Several days of beard. He wore no coat, only a shirt and waistcoat. And in the November chill of the corridor this read less as informality than as the statement of a man who had stopped keeping track of what was appropriate. His eyes were gray and entirely awake. "You're the new one," he said. His voice had the particular flatness of a voice that had stopped expecting conversation to go anywhere useful. "Nora Hill," she said. "I imagine that's what you mean." That he looked at her for a moment. Not the look of a man assessing whether she was pretty or well-dressed or likely to be manageable. The look of a man running a rapid calculation about what category of problem she represented. "How old are you?" 23. That he said nothing. "You look older than I expected," she said. Something shifted in his face. "Not offense." "Exactly. More like a man who had prepared himself for a specific kind of conversation and found himself in a different one. Most women don't open with that. Most women are trying to make a good impression. You're not, in trying to have an honest conversation," she said. "It seems more useful." He leaned against the doorframe, studying her with an attention that she recognized from sitting rooms and sickbeds, the attention of a person who has been lied to often enough to have made a project of learning how to detect it. "You know what I did?" he said. "It was not a question that I know your father died 3 years ago. I know it was a carriage accident. That's not what I'd call it. What would you call it?" He held her gaze. "Murder," he said. "I'd call it murder." The word sat in the corridor between them. She'd been waiting for it. In a sense she'd known from the solicitor's careful evasions that whatever had happened 3 years ago, this man had given it the heaviest name available and had been living under that name ever since. She'd prepared herself for the weight of it. What she hadn't prepared for was the way he watched her when he said it. As though he'd placed something on a scale and was waiting to see which way it tipped. She didn't flinch. She didn't rearrange her expression into something softer. She looked at him and said, "You opened the door." A pause. "That's all," she said. "You heard me knock. And you opened the door. That was your choice." Something crossed his face that she couldn't name immediately. It moved through too quickly. He shifted his weight on the walking stick. "Why father's solicitors arranged this," he said. "Not me. Your father's solicitors sent 11 other women to this door. You didn't open it for any of them." The corridor was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the oaks. "What do you want?" he said. "To speak with you." "That's all." "About what?" "Whatever you're willing to speak about." She paused. "I'm not here to convince you of anything, Your Grace. I'm not going to tell you the physicians might be wrong, or that you have a great deal to live for. Or that your father would have wanted you to. Don't." The word came out flat and hard. "I wasn't going to finish that sentence the way you think." He looked at her. "I was going to say," she continued, "that I have no idea what your father would have wanted. I never met him. I only know what you've decided he'd want, which is," she considered briefly, "for you to stay in this room and finish the sentence he started." The silence that followed was the longest yet. Guy Hamilton looked at her with the gray eyes that had been calculating her since the door opened. And for a moment she couldn't read anything in them at all. Then he stepped back from the doorway. "I don't need saving," he said. His voice had changed, still flat, but the flatness had a different quality now. Like a door that had been locked from the inside and could hear something on the other side it hadn't anticipated. "I am not here to save you," she said. "I made that clear to your solicitor." "Then what exactly are you here for?" She thought about it for a moment. "The honest answer. Not the useful one. Company," she said. "If you want it. And if you don't, they'll stay in my room and keep out of your corridor, and we can conduct this marriage entirely through Marsh for as long as necessary." She paused. "But I'm not leaving. That part isn't negotiable." He stared at her. "Why not?" "Because I told your solicitor it wouldn't be," she said, "and I keep my word." He looked at her for another long moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back into the room, leaving the door open behind him. She understood what that meant. She walked downstairs. Marsh heard Itwo's sets of footsteps where there had been one for 3 years. He set down the candlestick he was carrying and stood very still in the entrance hall and listened to the low Resistant sound of a conversation beginning in the east corridor. Then he went to the kitchen and put the kettle on, because it was the only useful thing he could think to do that he did not come down the first morning. Nora ate breakfast alone at the long mahogany table, which had been set for one. The dining room was a handsome room that had clearly once been used regularly. The furniture was good, the proportions generous, but it had the particular atmosphere of a room that had been abandoned mid-use. Like a clock stopped at a specific hour. She ate her toast and drank her tea and listened to the sounds of the house around her, footsteps, above. Slow, deliberate. Crossing the floor of his room and then stopping and then crossing back. He was awake. He was moving. He simply was not coming down. She turned a page of her book and kept reading. Edward Beaumont. She caught herself. Marsh. Marsh appeared in the doorway at 8:30 with the expression of a man who had been rehearsing something and was no longer sure he should say it. That he hasn't. Marsh began. That I know. Nora said. It's fine. That I only thought. People don't change their habits in a single afternoon. She looked up from her book. He spoke to me for nearly an hour yesterday. That's more than he's managed in months, by your account. Marsh was quiet for a moment. 3 years. He said carefully. He hasn't spoken to anyone for any real length of time in 3 years. Then an hour is considerable progress. She closed the book. Give him time, Marsh. Marsh left. She sat a moment longer, listening to the footsteps above, still crossing, still stopping. Still crossing back, and then she went to the parlor and read until lunch, the second morning. She heard him before she saw him. She was crossing the entrance hall on her way to breakfast when footsteps sounded on the stairs above her, not the slow midly off the night footsteps she had heard through the ceiling, but deliberate ones. Coming down. She looked up. He was standing at the first floor landing, one hand on the banister, fully dressed. Coat, cravat, hair combed back from his face. He looked like a man bracing for something unpleasant. And he was watching her with the gray eyes that she was beginning to understand were almost always doing more work than his face let on. There's coffee, she said. And Mrs. Pruitt made bread this morning. A pause. I don't particularly want bread. Then don't eat the bread. The coffee's ready either way. He looked at her. Then his foot moved to the top step. He came downstairs. He sat at the far end of the tablier, as far from her place as the furniture. Allowed and accepted the coffee Marsh poured without comment. He drank it. He did not eat the bread. He said almost nothing, but he was there. Mrs. Pruitt, who had cooked for Blackstone Hall for 19 years, appeared in the kitchen doorway at some point during the meal and stood very still with both hands pressed flat against the doorframe. She did not say a word. She understood, with the particular understanding of someone who has watched a household grieve for 3 years, that any word at all might break whatever thin and improbable thread had brought him down those stairs. After 20 minutes, he set down his cup and stood. It'll be in my room, he said. Of course, Nora said, without looking up from her book. He left. His footsteps went back up the stairs. And then back across the floor above her, and then stopped. Mrs. Pruitt let out a long, slow breath from the kitchen doorway. Nora wrote one line in the small journal she had started keeping. Day 2. He came to the table. George Hamilton arrived on a Thursday without notice. Which Marsh later said was entirely consistent with every other visit George Hamilton had ever made to any house had ever entered. He came through the front door at 2:30 in the afternoon with 2 traveling bags. A wife who looked as though she had long since made her peace with being an afterthought, and a voice that filled the entrance hall before the rest of him had fully arrived. Marsh, where's my cousin? Is he still? He stopped. Nora was standing in the doorway of the parlor with a book in her hand. And George Hamilton was looking at her with the rapid, automatic assessment of a man who catalogued women the way merchants catalog new stock, value, origin, likely purpose. He was perhaps 40, handsome in the way of men who had been told so often enough that they'd stopped questioning it. With the particular ease of someone who had never needed to wonder whether he was welcome anywhere. Hello, he said, and smiled. I don't believe we've met, Nora Hill, she said. In Guy's wife, the smile stayed in place, but something behind it shifted. She watched him file her into a category. Paid arrangement. Temporary. Manageable. That he didn't try to hide the calculation. He didn't think he needed to. How extraordinary, George said warmly. Turning toward Marsh. When did this happen? Why wasn't I informed? Uncle Edward would have. He stopped again, catching himself on the name. A brief recalibration. Well. Families should be told these things. The Duke prefers his privacy, Marsh said. In the tone of a man who has said this sentence several hundred times, George turned back to Nora with the smile fully reinstated. I'm sure he does. He always has. Though I must say, it's good to know someone's here with him. A pause that was slightly too long. Keeping him company, yes. Nora said. That's one way to put it. Dinner that evening was 4 people at a table that had been built for 14. Guy had come down not without effort, she suspected. Though he gave no outward sign of it. He sat at the head of the table with the walking stick propped against his chair and ate with the focused economy of a man who had recently remembered that eating was something he was supposed to do. He said little. He watched. George talked enough for all of them. Moving from topics with the ease of a man who had never experienced a silence he felt responsible for filling. The roads from London. The political situation. A horse head recently acquired. His wife whose name was Margaret and who ate quietly and smiled at appropriate intervals contributed occasional agreements. That it was over the soup that George turned to Nora. You must find it rather quiet here, he said, with the tone of a man offering sympathy. After all, a young woman of your fractional pause, energy. You must be accustomed to more active company. That I find it suits me. Nora said. Of course, of course. George lifted his wine glass. And your family? You're from Hampshire originally, was it, Dorset? She said. Dorset. Yes. And your people are. He seemed to search for the right word with the careful performance of a man who already knew exactly what word he wanted. Comfortable? In Dorset, my father is alive, if that's what you're asking. That I only wondered whether you had another pause. This one precisely waited, somewhere to return to. When circumstances change, the table went quiet. Margaret stopped eating. Marsh, serving from the sideboard, went very still. George. It came from the head of the table. Guy's voice, flat and unraised. Carrying the particular quality of a man who is choosing his words with great care because the alternative is something less controlled. George turned. Yes, she's my wife. Guy picked up his fork. Whatever you're working toward. Don't. George's smile widened slightly. I was only asking. You were being unkind, Guy said. You usually don't notice when you're doing it, which is generally how it goes with you. It doesn't make it less unkind. He set the fork down. Try the lamb. Mrs. Pruitt does it well. George laughed at an easy, social laugh that conceded nothing and turned the conversation to the lamb, but Nora had watched his face in the moment after Guy spoke. And she had seen something move through it that hadn't been there before. A recalibration more serious than the first one. A woman had filed as temporary was sitting at a table where the man who'd spent 3 years not defending anything had just defended her. That didn't fit the category. After din. George and Margaret retired early. Guy remained at the table, which he had not done before. He poured himself more wine and looked at the glass. That he means well, he said, after a while. In his way. He doesn't, particularly. Nora said. But I don't think he means badly either. I think he simply doesn't consider very carefully before he speaks. Guy looked at her. Something close to amusement crossed his face. Not warm, but present. That's a precise distinction. I've sat with enough people to learn the difference. She said. Between the ones who want to hurt and the ones who simply don't look where they're walking. Guy was quiet for a moment. Which is worse? The ones who don't look, she said. They do more damage, on average. He picked up his wine glass. He didn't answer. But he stayed at the table for another half hour, and in the morning George found a reason to leave 2 days earlier than had planned. It was the 9th day when she found him in the library. She hadn't known he used it. The library was on the ground floor, off the east passage. And in 9 days she had not seen him anywhere outside the dining room and his own corridor. But she came down before breakfast on the 9th morning to return a book she had borrowed from the shelves, and found him already there. Standing at the window with a letter in his hand. He didn't hear her come in. Or if he did, he gave no sign of it. She set the book back in its place quietly. She was nearly at the door when he spoke to him. Why father used to stand at that window, he said. Every morning. He said the light was best there before 8. Nora stopped. She turned around. He was still looking out the window, the letter held at his side. Now that it is good light, she said. That I haven't been in this room in 3 years. He said it without particular weight, as though noting a fact about the weather. I came in this morning and I didn't plan to. I was looking for a different passage and I ended up here. A pause. That seems like the kind of thing that should mean something, does it need to? He turned from the window then, and looked at her with the gray eyes that she was learning carried more information than his voice most of the time. You're very good at not telling people what to think, he said. I've found people generally know what to think, she said. They just need to be left alone to get there. He looked at the letter in his hand. Then he moved to the chair nearest the window, his father's chair, she suspected, from the way he paused before sitting in it, and sat down. Will you sit? He said. She Saturday. For a moment neither of them spoke. Outside the window, the November light came through the bare oaks at a low angle, the way Head said his father had liked it. And the library held its particular smell of old paper and cold stone and the faint ghost of tobacco from years past. Why father said I was not fit to inherit, Guy said. The night of the accident. He was looking at the letter, not at her. We'd been arguing since dinner. Head had reports from the estate manager, things I'd let fall behind, decisions I'd deferred. He said. He stopped. The details don't matter. The substance was that I was a disappointment and he was no longer willing to pretend otherwise. Nora said nothing. I took the reins, he said. We were halfway up the north road in the rain and I took the reins from him because I wanted to prove. A pause. I'm not entirely sure what I wanted to prove. That I could control something. Anything. He set the letter down on the side table. The road was wet. There was a bend. I knew that I'd driven it 100 times and I still misjudged it. He looked up. He was dead before the doctor arrived. The library was very quiet. I held his hand, Guy said. At the end. He was conscious for a few minutes. He looked at me and he said. He stopped. She waited. He said. I knew you'd ruin everything. The words came out level, recited. The way you recite something you've said over and over in the dark until it's worn the same groove in your mind every time. Those were the last words he said to me. Nora sat with that for a moment. She had been a caretaker long enough to know that there were things you didn't try to answer immediate. And things you didn't try to answer at all, and things that required something other than an answer entirely. Why mother died the day I was born, she said. He looked up. Difficult labor, she said. The doctor told my father afterward there had been warning signs. That she'd known there was risk. She chose to continue the pregnancy. She folded her hands in her lap. My father told me about it every year on my birthday. Not in those words, but clearly enough. The light moved slightly as a cloud passed outside. That he never said you killed her, Nora continued. He was too careful for that. He would simply mention her. How she'd been. How she'd looked. What she'd been planning to do that spring. A pause. The accounting was always there. I just had to do the arithmetic myself. Guy was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the calculating assessment from the doorway, not the careful flatness he used in most conversations. Something that was paying attention in a different way. So you understand, he said slowly. What it is to believe your existence is the debt, yes, and yet you're here. Yes. That he was quiet for a long moment. That's not the same, he said. What happened to you? You had no choice in it. I took the reins. I made a choice. You made a bad decision on a wet road in the dark while frightened and angry, Nora said. That's not the same as murder, Your Grace. Whatever word you've decided to use, something shifted in his jaw, you don't know. I know your father said you'd ruin everything, she said, steadily, and I know that you are sitting in his library for the first time in 3 years, in his chair. In his light. I don't know what that means to you. She paused. But it seems to me like you're arguing with him. And arguing with someone is not the same as agreeing with them. The silence that followed was long and had several different things moving in it at once. Guy Hamilton looked at his father's window, and his father's light, and the letter on the side table that she now understood he had probably not come to the library to read at all. You're a difficult woman to have a conversation with, he said, finally. I've been told, she said. Who told you? Most people have tried. Something crossed his face. Not a smile, not fully. But the shape of one, underneath, like a light source behind a curtain. Stay for breakfast, he said. If you haven't eaten. She hadn't. She stayed. The storm came in from the west on a Tuesday night. The kind that didn't announce itself, no gradual darkening, no wind building slowly through the afternoon. 1 hour the sky was clear and cold. And the next the rain was against the windows in sheets and the thunder was already directly overhead. Nora woke at 2:30 to the sound of it. She lay still for a moment, listening. Rain. Thunder, rolling west to east. The ordinary sounds of a house in a storm, the settling of old stone. The rattle of a shutter somewhere on the floor below, and then something else, the tap of a walking stick on floorboards. Moving through the east corridor, past her door, toward the stairs. Not the careful, measured pace she had learned to recognize from the corridor above her during sleepless nights. Something faster. Something that had a direction. She got up. She found him at the ground floor. Not in the entrance hall but in the back passage that led to the stables and the outbuildings. He was standing at the door to the carriage house with his hand on the latch and his head bowed, not moving. He had a coat on over his nightshirt, pulled close against the cold. And the walking stick was braced against the doorframe that he didn't hear her approach. Or he did, and it didn't change anything. Nora stopped a few feet behind him. The carriage house door was half open. Through it, she could see the interior and the thing inside it. The carriage was still there. She hadn't known. No one had mentioned it, and in 3 weeks she hadn't had occasion to come to this part of the outbuildings. But there it was, a dark traveling carriage listing to one side. Its left rear wheel gone. The axle resting on a wooden block someone had wedged under it years ago and apparently never removed. The lacquered body was dulled with dust and the damp of 3 winters. The Hamilton crest on the door panel had faded to something almost unreadable. One of the carriage lamps had been broken at S. Point and never replaced. That it had the quality of something that had not been touched since the exact moment it had been brought back. Outside, the rain came down harder. The thunder moved east. That I drove that road 100 times. Guy said. He wasn't speaking to her particularly. He was speaking to the carriage, or to the rain, or to the dark. I knew every bend of it. I drove it in worse weather than that night. Nora said nothing that he was angry. Guy said. Wash had every right to be angry. The estate accounts were behind. There were decisions I'd deferred for 6 months because I couldn't. He stopped. Started again. I kept thinking I'd understand what to do if I had a little more time. I kept thinking the right answer would become clear. Hi's voice was flat and careful. It didn't. And had run out of patience. The rain was very loud on the carriage house roof. He wasn't a cruel man. Guy said. I want to be accurate about that. He was exacting. He had standards and he expected them to be met, and when they weren't he said so plainly. That was simply how he was. A pause. The things he said that night weren't things He'd never said before. They were the same things He'd always said, only all of them at once, in the rain, and he stopped. He hadn't moved his hand from the latch. I took the reins to stop the argument, he said. I told myself it was because the horse was spooked by the thunder, but that wasn't why. I took them because I wanted him to stop talking. And because if I was driving I couldn't be wrong about everything else. He exhaled. The bend was 30 feet further than I remembered. Or I was going faster than I thought. I don't even now I don't know exactly what happened. I only know that the carriage went over. And when I got to him, he stopped. Long enough that she counted the seconds without meaning to. He was conscious for a few minutes, he said. I've told you that, yes, what I didn't tell you. He stopped again. His hand tightened on the latch. He looked at me. And I thought for a moment he was going to say something else. His face was different than it had been during the argument. Quieter. A pause. And then he said it. I knew you'd ruin everything. And then he didn't say anything else. The rain. Nora walked forward until she was standing beside him, not behind him, beside him, and looked at the carriage. It had sat here for 3 years. Through 2 winters and 1 spring and another winter and another. Someone had brought it back from the road, had wedged the axle on that block, had closed the door and walked away, and no one had opened it again or moved it or done anything at all about the thing sitting in the carriage house that was not, in any sense, just a broken carriage. Why mother didn't say anything, Nora said. She couldn't. At the end she was too weak. The doctor told my father she'd slipped away quietly. She paused. When I was 12, my father told me that she'd looked at me before she died. Just looked. And then closed her eyes. She let that sit for a moment. I used to think that was the worst part. That she'd seen me and said nothing. That there was no verdict. No sentence. Just a look. Guy turned his head slightly toward her. Now I think, Nora said. That silence is the hardest thing to argue with. Your father gave you a sentence. It was the wrong sentence. But it was a sentence. It has specific words, and specific words can be examined. She looked at the crest on the carriage door. Faded almost to nothing. I've spent 23 years trying to argue with a look. You can't. There's nothing to hold on to. He was very still. I am not saying it wasn't terrible. She said. What he said. I'm saying it was wrong. And wrong things said by dying men in the rain on bad nights are not verdicts. They're not testimony. There she paused. Finding the right word. They're the last thing a frightened man could think of to say. The thunder had moved further east. The rain was beginning to ease. Guy Hamilton stood at the door of the carriage house for a long time without speaking. Then something happened that she hadn't expected. And wouldn't have predicted, even having spent 3 weeks learning to read him. He bent his head, and his shoulders changed, and she understood that he was crying, not loudly, not with any performance around it. But the way people cry when something they've been holding at a particular angle for a very long time finally shifts and the weight of it goes somewhere else. She didn't speak. She didn't move toward him. She stood beside him in the open door of the carriage house with the rain coming off the roof in a thin curtain between them and the yard, and she stayed there, and she let it be what it was. After a while, without looking at her, he found her hand in the dark. His fingers were cold. They closed around hers and held on, not gently. The way a person holds on when they are doing it for structural reasons rather than tenderness. She held on back. The rain stopped sometime after that. Neither of them moved for a while after it did. She found him changed after that night. And not in the ways she might have expected. He didn't become easier. He didn't soften in the obvious directions. He was still precise, still sparing with words. Still capable of a silence that could empty a room. But something in the quality of his presence had shifted, like a door that has been shut against pressure for a long time and has now been simply closed. Which looks the same from the outside but is an entirely different thing. That he came down for breakfast every morning. He had begun eating properly, not dramatically. Mrs. Pruitt had been carefully coached and made no comment. But the trays stopped coming back full, and one morning he ate eggs and asked for more toast and talked for 20 minutes about a letter from his land agent in a tone that suggested he was actually thinking about what the letter said rather than simply processing it as noise. That he walked the grounds. In the afternoon, when the weather permitted, Nora walked with him sometimes. Other times she watched from the upstairs window and said nothing about it. He did not mention the carriage house. She did not mention it either. It was on a Thursday morning, 5 weeks after her arrival. That she came down to breakfast and found him already at the table with a set of folded papers in front of him and an expression she hadn't seen before, something between concentration and something that might, at a distance, have resembled purpose. Estate accounts, he said. When she sat down. From the last 3 years. Marsh has been keeping them in reasonable order, but there are a pause. There are things that need decisions, yes. She said that I am going to need the library for most of the morning. He'll use the parlor. He nodded. He poured his own coffee. He looked at the papers, and then he looked at her, and he said, with the careful deliberateness of someone who has rehearsed something and is now uncertain whether to say it. The night in the carriage house, Nora waited. I haven't. He stopped. I don't know how to. He stopped again. He looked at the papers. Thank you, he said. That's all. I don't have better words for it than that. You don't need better words. She said that he went to the library. She went to the parlor. Outside, the December light came in low and pale across the grounds of Blackstone Hall, and in the carriage house the broken carriage sat as it had always sat. And in the library a man who had not looked at his own estate accounts in 3 years spread them across his father's desk and began to look. It was Nora who found the solicitor's papers. She hadn't been looking for them. She'd gone to the library in the early afternoon to return a volume she'd borrow. And found that Guy had left for a walk with the land agent who'd come out from the village, and in his absence she'd gone to replace the book and found the folded packet on the corner of the desk where he'd set it aside. Correspondence from the London solicitors, she assumed. The routine kind that arrived every few weeks and that Marsh sorted by urgency. The packet had come open at one end. The top sheet was visible. She wouldn't have read it, except that she saw her own name. Re. The engagement of Miss Nora Hill, terms as follows. Annual payment of £500, disbursed quarterly, for the duration of the arrangement or until the natural termination of the Duke's life. Whichever comes first, she read it once. Then she put the packet down exactly as she'd found it and went back to the parlor. She was sitting at the window when she heard the front door, and then his footsteps in the entrance hall. And Thena pause. Longer than usual. The sound of something set down on the hall table, then footsteps toward the library, then silence. She kept her hands folded in her lap and waited. He found her in the parlor 10 minutes later. He was holding the packet. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen before and hoped not to see again. Not anger, not exactly, though anger was part of it. Something underneath the anger that was older and more deeply lodged, the expression of a man whose worst conviction about himself has just been handed evidence. £500. He said. Nora didn't pretend not to understand. Per year, he said. Until I die. He set the packet on the table between them. That's what my solicitors are paying you. There is a financial arrangement, she said. Yes, did you know about this before you came? I knew the terms of the arrangement before I signed the contract. Something moved through his face. You knew that I told you on the first day that I keep my word, she said. Steadily. I told you I wasn't here to perform anything. I haven't changed either of those things. You told me you were here because no man should die believing himself a murderer. His voice had gone very quiet. Which was worse than if he'd raised it. Was that he stopped? Was that something you arrived at yourself, or was it in the briefing materials? The words landed with the precision of something aimed. She opened her mouth, and then something happened that she hadn't anticipated and couldn't entirely prevent. She couldn't answer. Not because the answer wasn't true, it was true, entirely true. She had meant every word of it, but because the full truth required saying the rest of it, the part about her mother and her father's October letters and 23 years of arithmetic, and standing here in the cold parlor with his face doing what it was doing. She found that the words weren't available to her. They were there, she could feel them, but they were behind something she couldn't get through quickly enough. It's true, she said. What I told you is true. Then tell me why. His voice cracked on the last word, a single fracture. Immediately controlled. Tell me why someone signs a contract to marry a man she's never met and stay with him while he dies. And it's not about £500 a year that I can't. She stopped. Started again. The reason I came is more complicated than I can explain right now. But it is not money. I swear to you it is not money. You can't explain it, not right now. Not like this. That he looked at her for a long moment. Chet him make the decision, not slowly, not with any of the careful deliberateness he usually brought to things, but the fast, irreversible decision of a man who has been waiting for proof of something and believes he has just received it. Then I have nothing further to say. He said that he picked up the packet and walked out of the parlor. She heard his footsteps in the passage, and then the library door, and then the bolt. The house went quiet. Nora sat at the parlor window with her hands folded in her lap and looked out at the December grounds of Blackstone Hall. And did not move for a long time. Outside, in the carriage house, the broken carriage sat in the dark exactly as it had always. Saturday she did not knock. She stood in the passage outside the library door for a moment, looking at the thin line of lamplight underneath it. And then she sat down on the floor with her back against the wall beside the door and her hands in her lap. The stone floor was cold. The passage was dark except for that line of light. Somewhere below, she could hear Mrs. Pruitt moving in the kitchen, the distant sound of a pot being set down. Water being poured, and then that stopped too, and the house was quiet. Nora Saturday she had done this once before. Not on a floor, not in a cold passage in Hampshire, in a room in Dorset, outside her brother's door, which was not her brother but the closest approximation. Her cousin Thomas, who had come to live with them at 14 and whom she had helped raise for 6 years. Thomas, who had gone quiet the winter he was 19, a different kind of quiet than she had known from him, a grey and receding quiet. And she had stood outside his door and told herself he needed space, he needed time, she couldn't push. She had given him space, she had given him 3 weeks of space, and on the last morning of those 3 weeks she had knocked and there had been no answer, and she had opened the door. And she had understood in an instant that all the space she had given him had not been patience or wisdom or respect for his privacy, that it had been its own kind of leaving. She had not said this to the solicitor. She had not said it to her father. Who would have found a way to make it another entry in the ledger against her? She had said it once, to the doctor who came afterward, in a cold parlor while she was still not entirely certain she was awake. I thought he needed space. The doctor had said nothing useful. She had carried it since then as a specific kind of knowledge, that space could be a weapon, that patience could be a form of abandonment. That the kindest looking thing and the cruelest thing could have exactly the same shape from the outside. So she sat on the floor outside the library door, and she did not give him space, she gave him presence instead. Her presence, the fact of her, in the passage. Not going anywhere. Not performing patience. Not waiting for him to be ready. Simply being the person who was there. An hour passed. Marsh came through the passage at 9 o'clock with a small tray tea. 2 cups, and stopped when he saw her. He looked at her on the floor for a long moment. Then he set the tray down quietly beside her without a word and went back the way he had come. She drank 1 cup. The other she left. Another hour. At some point she stopped thinking about what she would say when the door opened, because she understood that there was nothing to prepare. Either the truth was enough or it wasn't, and the truth was not something she could improve with rehearsal. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the particular weight of a door you couldn't open in time. And how it was different from a door you'd chosen not to open, and how those two things had lived in the same place in her chest for 4 years and she had never properly distinguished them until now. She had not chosen to leave Thomas. She had not understood, until it was too late. That staying required a different kind of presence than the one she had been offering. She understood it now. The lamplight under the door shifted, moved the lamp. She heard footsteps crossing the library floor. Slow and deliberate. A pause near the door, then silence again. She didn't speak. She didn't knock. She waited. The bolt slid back, the door opened. Guy Hamilton looked down at her on the floor. She had pulled her knees up at some point and had her back against the wall, and for a moment neither of them said anything. He looked terrible, not in any medical sense, but in the way people look when they've spent 2 hours alone with something they've been successfully avoiding for a long time and have finally stopped avoiding it. His eyes were red at the rims. He was holding the door handle with his right hand and his walking stick with his left, and he was looking at her with an expression she didn't try to name. "You're on the floor," he said. "That I know." "Why?" She looked up at him. "Because you were in there." He stared at her. "That's all," she said. "Not to wait for you to be ready. Not to give you space. Just because you were in there. And I wasn't going to be anywhere else." He was very still. "I had someone," she said, "a few years ago. Someone I cared about who went quiet, the way you went quiet. And I stood outside his door and told myself he needed time and space, and I wasn't going to push." She kept her voice level with the practice of someone who has said hard things in front of people enough times to know how to do it without falling apart. "And I was wrong. I was wrong about what he need. Ed, and I was wrong to call it kindness, and I have been wrong about it every day since." She paused. "That's why I came here," she said. "Not £500. Not any briefing materials. I came because when your solicitor's notice found me, I saw a door I had failed to stay outside of before. And I thought." She stopped. "I thought I could try again. I thought I could stay this time." Guy Hamilton stood in the doorway with the lamplight behind him and looked at her on the floor of the cold passage. "You've been there the whole time," he said slowly. "Every time if morning I didn't come down. After the carriage house, today." "Yes, you weren't." He stopped. "You weren't performing any of it." "That I don't know how to perform anything convincingly," she said. "I've tried. I'm not built for it." He stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he stepped back. "Come in," he said. "It's cold in the passage." She got up off the floor. She went in. The library was warm from the lamp and smelled of old paper and the remains of a fire that had burned down to coals. Had been sitting at the desk. She could see the estate papers still spread across it, though she suspected he hadn't been reading them. He moved to the chairs by the fireplace and she sat across from him, and for a while neither of them spoke, which was not uncomfortable. "Thomas," he said finally. "Yes." "How old was he?" 19. She looked at her hands. "Had wanted to study medicine. He hadn't told anyone because he thought." She stopped. "He thought it wasn't the kind of thing he was supposed to want." Guy was quiet. "He was funny," she said. "He made terrible jokes at breakfast and was completely unrepentant about it. He could make anyone laugh." A pause. "Before he went quiet." "I am sorry," Guy said. She looked up. He was watching her with the expression she'd seen once or twice. Not pity. Something that recognized grief, and sat beside it without trying to do anything about it. "Thank you," she said. They sat with the fire burning down between them, and outside the December wind moved through the bare oaks, and the house settled around them. And neither of them felt the need to fill it. After a while, he said, "The money, yes. That I understand why you couldn't explain it." His voice was careful. "I understand it now. I'm not saying." He stopped. "I'm not saying I handled it well." "You handled it the way anyone would," she said. "You've been waiting for confirmation that nothing is real, and it looked like confirmation. That it still looks like it, a little. That I know, and you're still here. That I told you," she said. "That part isn't negotiable." Something in his face shifted. The same movement she'd seen in the doorway on the very first day, when she'd told him had opened the door by choice. Something that was not quite surrender and not quite trust, and was somewhere in the country between them. "Stay," he said. "Just stay. Not because of the contract. Because I'm asking you to." "Yes," she said simply. "I'll stay." He proposed going to the village on a Wednesday morning in late December. With the particular manner of someone who has made a decision and is slightly surprised to find himself having made it. "Hargrove," he said, at breakfast, "I need to speak with the land agent in person. And there are some accounts at the dry goods that have been running on credit." Since he paused. "Since some time ago. They should be settled." "All right," Nora said. "It's 2 miles." I know." He looked at her. "I haven't been to the village in 3 years." I know that too. People will stare, probably." She put down her toast. "Would you like company, or would you prefer to go alone?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'd like you to come," he said, with the directness she had come to trust more than almost anything else about him. Not I suppose you could, or if you'd like just the plain fact of what he wanted, then he'll come, she said. They walked that he set the pace, not the careful, rationed walk of the early weeks, but something more deliberate. A man moving through space had decided he was entitled to occupy. The winter light was thin and pale and the road was frozen hard underfoot, and they walked the 2 miles largely in silence, which was comfortable in the way their silences had become comfortable, not empty, but full of the particular quality of two people who had run out of need to perform anything for each other. She felt the moment Hargrove came into view. His pace didn't change. His expression didn't change. But something in the set of his shoulders altered slightly. The way a person adjusts when they become aware of being watched before they've confirmed it. She said nothing. She kept walking at exactly the same pace. At exactly the same position at his side, they came into the main street. The effect moved through it the way effects move through small villages, not a ripple, more like a current. One person noticing and turning and the next person noticing them noticing. A woman outside the draper's shop stopped mid-sentence and stared. Two men talking in front of the public house went quiet. A girl of about 10 changed direction abruptly to avoid them. Which Nora suspected had been instructed by her mother at some prior point. Guy felt it. She knew he felt it because she was paying attention to him and not to the village, and she saw the slight tightening a breath held. A fraction of a second's hesitation between one step and the next. She didn't reach for him. She didn't position herself between him and the staring. She walked at his side exactly as she had walked the whole 2 miles, as though the street were empty. After 10 seconds. His stride settled again. The land agent's office was on the far end of the main street, above the saddlers. They were halfway there when a boy came running, perhaps 14, out of breath. With the look of someone who had been sent on a specific errand and was very aware of it, that he stopped in front of Guy and made an approximate bow. Your Grace. My grandfather sent me. Guy stopped. Your grandfather, Silas Baird, sir. The blacksmith. He's too old to come himself. But he said. The boy caught his breath. He said you might not remember, but about 6 years ago, maybe 7, you came down the north road and found his cart had gone into the ditch past the Miller's Cross. In the February. It was very cold. Guy was very still. He says you stopped and helped him get it out. The boy continued. You and another man. He says the cold was bad and you stayed until the whole thing was up and the wheel was checked and everything was right. A pause. He says he never thanked you properly because you'd already gone. And he wanted you to know he remembered. The boy finished his message and looked at Guy with the steady gaze of someone who has completed a task and is waiting to be dismissed. Guy looked at him for a moment. Something was moving in his face that Nora watched without comment. Tell your grandfather, Guy said, finally. That I remember the ditch. And that I'm glad the wheel held. The boy nodded and ran back the way he'd come. Guy stood on the main street of Hargrove and looked after him. I'd forgotten that, he said quietly. What do you remember about it? It was very cold. A pause. He was an old man and the cart was heavy and it had gone in at an angle that made it difficult. We were there for an hour, at least. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't think about it afterward. It was just something that needed doing. Yes. Nora said that. He looked at her. That's all, she said. I'm not making a point. I just teased that. He held her gaze for a moment with an expression she had been trying not to catalogue, the one she didn't have a reliable name for but that appeared, she had noticed. Specifically when she said something he hadn't prepared a defense against. They went to the land agent. They settled the accounts at the dry goods. By the end of an hour, 4 people had approached Guy in the street. The saddler, who shook his hand, the vicar's wife, who told him she was glad to see him looking well and managed to mean it, an elderly farmer who talked for 10 minutes about drainage issues on the East Fields as though the last 3 years had simply been a period during which the Duke had been busy, and the land agent himself, who walked them back to the road and said nothing about anything except the north field fencing and the spring planting schedule. The village did not forget. But it remembered, also, how to hold him. Walking home, in the last of the winter light, Guy said, that was. He stopped. Ordinary. Nora said, yes. A pause. I'd forgotten what that felt like. Ordinary is underrated. She said that he looked at her sideways, the particular look she'd come to recognize as the one that preceded him saying something had decided to say rather than something had calculated, and then he stopped walking. She stopped too. That he stood in front of her on the frozen road with the bare hedgerows on either side and the last thin light coming at a low angle across the fields, and he looked at her for a moment, and then he leaned down and pressed his lips to her forehead. That it was brief. It was careful. It was. In 1819, on a public road 200 yards from the edge of a village where at least 6 people had just seen them together for the first time, a declaration. That he straightened. He looked at her with the gray eyes that were, she had finally concluded, incapable of saying anything they didn't mean. Thank you, he said, for coming. She looked at him on the frozen road, in the winter light, and thought that thank you for coming was doing a great deal of work for a small sentence. You're welcome, she said. They walked home. January came in cold and stayed cold. The estate accounts took most of December and ran into the new year. There was more to untangle than Guy had initially estimated. 3 years of deferred decisions compounding quietly in ledgers that Marsh had kept in order but had not been empowered to act on. Guy worked at his father's desk most mornings, and Nora found that the library had become a room where 2 people could occupy opposite ends in companionable silence. She with a book or her correspondence, he with the papers that accumulated and diminished and accumulated again. That he was, she had come to understand, genuinely good at this. Not in the way of a man performing competence to prove something, but in the quieter way of someone whose instincts were sound and who had simply stopped using them. He asked questions of the land agent and listened to the answers. He wrote letters to creditors and tenants with the same precision he brought to everything. He made decisions without lengthy deliberation, which she had noticed was a quality that made everyone around him function better. It was on a Tuesday morning in the second week of January that the post arrived. Nora was in the parlor, writing a letter to an acquaintance in Dorset who had been kind to her in the difficult months after Thomas, when Marsh brought in the small bundle of morning correspondence. Most of it was for Guy. One letter was for her. She recognized her father's handwriting. She had been expecting it. It was past October. He was later than usual this year, nearly 3 months late. Which was either a mercy or a bad sign, she hadn't decided which. She opened it with the same briskness she had developed for these letters over the years, quickly, before she could think about it. That it was brief. It was always brief. The usual contents, his health, the state of the house. A mention of the weather. One sentence about her mother's birthday having passed in November. She would have been 44, delivered with the flat precision of a man laying down a legal document, and then, at the end, a line she had never seen before: your mother said something before she died. It is not anything you need to know. I have always thought it better that you didn't. Nora read the line twice, then she put the letter face down on the table and sat very still. She was still sitting there when Guy came through from the library 20 minutes later, looking for the estate map that Marsh had last seen in the parlor. He stopped when he saw her face. What is it? She picked up the letter and held it out without speaking. He took it. He read it. She watched his eyes move to the final lines and stopped. He read it again, then he set the letter down on the table between them and looked at her with an expression that was doing several things at once. You've never asked him what she said? His voice was careful. That I didn't know there was anything to ask. She looked at the letter. He never mentioned it before. 23 years of letters and he never. She stopped. I assumed she hadn't said anything. I assumed she couldn't. At the end, but she did. Apparently. Guy was quiet for a moment. Outside the parlor window, the January fields lay flat and gray under a white sky. That he decided, Guy said slowly, that you didn't need to know. Yes, that he made that decision for you, without asking you. Yes, she heard the particular quality that had entered his voice. Not anger, something more precise than anger, and she looked up from the letter. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized, because she had seen it directed inward at him many times. The expression of a person following a thread to its logical end and not entirely welcoming where it arrived. You've spent 23 years, he said, building an accounting around a silence he created. That I didn't. She stopped. I assumed the silence meant something. You assumed it meant what he told you it meant. He paused. Which is he stopped. She watched him stop. She watched him understand, in real time, that the sentence he was about to finish applied to more than just her father and more than just her. The parlor was very quiet. You only accepted the verdict he wrote for you. Nora said softly. Not to be unkind. Because it was true and they had an agreement about true things that he looked at her. Yes, he said. I did. A long pause. We both did. She looked at the letter on the table. Her father's handwriting. Small and careful, and 23 years of October damage in every line of it. That I want to know what she said, Nora said. I think I need to know. How would you find out? She thought about it. The doctor who attended her is dead, I know that. But the parish records in Dorset might have something. And there was a woman who assisted at the birth. A neighbor. She moved away, but she paused. There's the vicar. He was there that day. He's very old now, but I think he's still alive. Write to him. Guy said that he might not remember. Write to him anyway. He looked at the letter again. Then at her. You've been arguing with a silence for 23 years. At least find out what the silence was covering. She wrote the letter that afternoon. The reply came 3 weeks later. On a Thursday that IT arrived while Guy was out with the land agent inspecting the North Field drainage, a problem that had been quietly worsening since the autumn and had recently become impossible to defer. Nora was alone in the library when Marsh brought the post. She recognized the Dorset postmark. She set it on the desk in front of her and looked at it for a moment. Then she opened it. The vicar's letter was written in the large, slightly unsteady hand of an old man who had taken care with his words. Dear Mrs. Hamilton. It began. I remember your mother clearly. She was a woman of considerable quiet strength, which I think you may not have been told. Nora stopped. She read the sentence again. That I was present at the end. As I was for most in the parish in those years. Your mother was conscious for a short time after you were born. She did ask to hold you. I want you to know that. The library was very still. She could not speak clearly by then. But she made herself understood to those of us present. She had written something beforehand, knowing there was risk. She gave it to me to keep, not to your father. I think she understood, as women often do in these situations, that it might not reach you if she left it with him. She instructed me to give it to you when you were grown. If you ever came looking, you have not come to Dorset. But you have written. I think that is close enough. The letter is enclosed. Nora's hands were not entirely steady when she unfolded the second sheet. That it was brief. The handwriting was different from her father's, rounder, slightly hurried. The writing of someone who had not been certain how much time she had. To my daughter, if she reads this. I want you to know that I chose this. Not because I was made to, not because I didn't understand the risk. The doctor had been very clear. And I understood him. I chose it because I wanted you. Not a child in general, not an heir or a comfort or a proof of anything. You, specifically, though I didn't know yet who you would be. That wanting was mine. It belongs to me and not to anyone else, and no one can take it from me. Not even the outcome. That if you have grown up being told that your existence was a debt, I want you to know that is not true. It was never true. You were wanted before you were anything else, and that is the only accounting that matters. That if you are reading this, it means you were curious enough to look. I think I would have liked that about you, your mother. Nora sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. She was not, in the ordinary course of things, someone who cried easily or often. She had trained herself out of it over years of sick rooms and difficult mornings, the way you train yourself out of things that cost too much in front of people who need you steady. She had learned to feel things at a slight distance. To put a pane of glass between herself and the worst of it. The glass was not available at the moment. She sat in the library with her mother's letter in her hands and cried quietly and without any performance, the way she did the few times she allowed herself to. And the fire burned down in the grate and the January light moved across the floor. She was still there when she heard the front door and then Guy's voice in the entrance hall asking Marsh something about the drainage survey. She folded the letters carefully. Both of them her father's and her mother. She put them in her pocket, she was composed, or near enough. By the time his footsteps reached the library door he came in and stopped when he saw her face. She took out the letters and held them out without speaking. He came across the room and took them. He sat down across from her and read them, in order her father's first, then the vicar's. Then her mother's last. That he read her mother's letter twice, then he refolded them with the same care she'd used and held them out to her. She was right, he said. About the accounting. Nora took the letters back. She held them in both hands. She chose it. Nora said. She knew the risk and she chose it anyway. A pause. I've spent 23 years thinking I arrived and took something. And she stopped. She'd already decided I was worth it before I existed. Guy was quiet for a moment. You didn't take anything. He said. That was never what happened. He paused. Your father made it what happened, in the telling. But that's not the same as the truth. She looked at him. The truth, he said carefully, is that she wanted you. That's the first fact. Everything else your father built on top of it is construction. It's his architecture, not hers. Nora looked at the letters in her hands. She thought of 23 Octobers. 23 letters in her father's handwriting, each one a careful, precise, deniable addition to a structure that had felt like fact because it had been there for as long as she could remember. She thought of the arithmetic she'd done for so many years. The careful balancing of a ledger that she now understood had been falsified at the entry. You only accepted the verdict he wrote for you, Guy said. Her own words, from the parlor 3 weeks ago, returned to her now without comment. Just the echo of them, offered back. She looked at him. Yes. She said. I did. He reached across the space between their chairs and covered her hand with his. Not the cold, structural grip of the carriage house, but something more deliberate, more chosen. Then don't. He said. Not anymore. She turned her hand over. His fingers closed around hers. Outside the library window, the January fields lay quiet under a white sky, and the bare oaks threw their shadows long across the frozen ground. And in the carriage house the broken carriage sat in the dark, though neither of them was thinking about it at the moment, and that, too, was a kind of change. April came back to Blackstone Hall the way it always did, without asking permission, without ceremony. Pushing up through the frozen ground in the East Garden with the particular indifference of things that have been doing what they do for a very long time and have no interest in whether anyone was ready for them. The roses had been the first project. Guy had mentioned it in February. In the library, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely. The East Garden, Head said, looking out the window at the bare, overgrown beds. My mother planted most of it. It's been. Head paused. It's been left alone for longer than it should have been, Nora had said. Tell me what it looked like. He had. Specifically, in the way he did things he cared about, not a general impression but the particular details, where the climbing roses had been trained along the south-facing wall, which varieties his mother had preferred. The way the beds had been arranged so that something was always in flower from April through October. Head talked for 40 minutes and Shed listened to all of it, and by the end of the morning they had a plan. And Thomas, the land agent's son, who had lately become indispensable in ways that had surprised everyone except Nora, had been dispatched to a nursery in Winchester with a written list. The work had taken 2 months. It was not finished. Gardens on this scale didn't finish in a season. And they both understood that. But by the last week of April the south-facing beds had been cleared and replanted, the climbing roses had been cut back to healthy wood and retrained along the wall, and the first buds were showing on the climbers nearest the house. On a Tuesday evening, with the light going golden and long across the grounds, Guy came to find her. She was in the East Garden, checking the new plantings along the far wall, and she heard him before she saw him, the walking stick on the flagstone path. The slightly altered rhythm that meant he was moving without particular urgency, the pace Shed learned to read over 5 months of listening to it. Come and sit, he said, when he reached her. The bench at the garden center was an old one, iron and stone, positioned where his mother had apparently liked to sit in the evenings. They had cleaned it in March and discovered it was better than it had looked under 20 years of weather. She sat beside him. The garden settled into its evening quiet around them. He looked at the roses along the south wall for a long time without speaking. She let him. She had gotten very good, over 5 months, at letting him arrive at things in his own time, and he had gotten very good at actually arriving that I want to tell you something. He said, all right, I've been trying to find the right words for it since he paused. For a while. I'm not certain there are right words, but I've decided that's not a good enough reason to keep not saying it. Nora waited that I spent 3 years in that room, he said. Waiting for something I'd decided was inevitable. No'd want to be precise about this, not the dying itself. I'd made a kind of peace with that. Or what I told myself was peace. What I was waiting for was the end of the waiting. I'd decided there was nothing left worth the effort of reaching for. He looked at the roses. I'd decided the room was all there was, and then you opened the door. She said, and then I opened the door. He turned to look at her. I don't entirely know why I did. I've thought about it. I think I was tired of my own verdict. I think some part of me was looking for any reason to question it. And you knocked like you expected me to answer that I did expect you to answer, she said. That I know. That was different. Everyone else knocked like they expected silence. He paused. You knocked like the answer was simply a matter of time. The evening light moved through the rose canes, throwing thin shadows across the flagstones. You said something to me, he said, the night you sat outside the library door. You said you came here because you'd failed to stay outside someone else's door. And you thought this was a door you were supposed to try again. He held her gaze. I've been thinking about that. About what it means that you framed it that why is your second chance, not my rescue. It was both. She said honestly. I think most true things are, yes. He was quiet for a moment. But I want to say something about the money. About the contract. She waited. Why solicitors paid you to come, he said. That's a fact. I can't unknow it, and I don't want to unknow it. Because it's part of what happened and I don't have any interest in editing what happened. He looked at her steadily. But you sat on a cold floor for 2 hours because I was on the other side of a door. No one paid you for that. There is no line in any contract that covers 2 hours on a stone floor. In December. No. She said. There isn't, and the carriage house. And every morning you came down to breakfast when you could have taken your tea in your room. And he stopped. All of it. All of it after the first day was yours. Your choice. He searched for the word. Your presence. That's what you gave me. Not vice. Not performance. Presence. She looked at him in the April evening, this man who had spent 3 years in a room waiting for his own end and who was now sitting on his mother's bench in his mother's garden with new roses on the south wall and an expression on his face that she had learned. Over 5 months, to trust completely. You told me, she said, on the first morning you said you didn't need saving. That I didn't. Know. She paused. But you needed someone to stay. And I needed somewhere to stay. And those two things turned out to be, she considered, usefully compatible. Something crossed his face. Not the almost smile she'd seen in the early weeks, the full one, the one that had taken months to arrive and was now simply his, the face of a man who was present in his own life. That's a very practical way to describe it. He said that I am a practical person. You're not, particularly, he said. You sat on a stone floor for 2 hours and you write letters to dead women and you walked into a house that 11 other people walked out of. That's not practical. He paused. That's something else. What? He looked at her for a long moment. That's choosing, he said. That's what it looks like when someone actually chooses something. I'd forgotten what it looked like. He reached over and took her hand, not the cold desperate grip of the carriage house. Not the careful deliberateness of the parlor after her mother's letter, but something that had become, over months of practice, simply natural. I love you. I want to say it plainly, because I've spent 3 years not saying plain things and am trying to do better. I love you. And am glad you knocked like you expected me to answer. Nora looked at their hands. She thought of the contract on the solicitor's desk in November, the last page she hadn't read because she had already known what it said. She thought of her father's October letters. 23 years of careful damage. She thought of Thomas, and the door she hadn't stayed outside, and the specific weight of that failure and what she had done with it. She thought of a woman she had never met who had written a letter and given it to a vicar to keep. Who had looked at a risk clearly and chosen anyway, who had wanted specifically and without apology. That wanting was mine, her mother had written. It belongs to me and not to anyone else that I know. Nora said. I've known for a while. She turned to look at him. I love you too. I think I was waiting until I was certain I was saying it as myself and not as she paused, as the version of me that needed to be here for other reasons, and now. Now I'm certain. She paused. The other reasons aren't gone. They're still part of why I came. But they're not why I'm staying. I'm staying because I want to. Because she stopped. Found the right words. Because you're worth staying for. That's the whole of it. That he looked at her. The evening light was nearly gone now, the garden settling into its blue dusk, the roses on the south wall losing their color to the dark. Somewhere in the oaks beyond the garden wall a bird was making its last noise of the day. Stay, then, he said. Not because of contracts or debts or second chances. Just stay, yes. She said. I'll stay. She noticed it on the way back to the house. They were walking along the flagstone path that ran between the garden and the outbuildings, and she happened to glance toward the carriage house as they passed it. And she stopped. The door was open, not the way it had been open on the night of the storm, not as a destination, not as a place of reckoning. Just open, the way you leave a door open on a mild evening when you've been in and out of a place doing ordinary work. Inside, where the broken carriage had stood for 3 years, there was nothing. The floor was swept. A new set of harness hung on the wall, clean and oiled. In the far corner, partly visible through the open door, was a different carriage, smaller, newer. The kind of vehicle meant for ordinary use on ordinary roads. She stood looking at it for a moment. That I had it moved in February, Guy said, beside her. The old one. I didn't. He paused. I didn't announce it. I just asked Thomas to arrange it. Where did it go? I don't know exactly. Thomas handled it. Another pause. I thought about having it repaired. But it seemed like a repair was the wrong answer. It wasn't a broken carriage. It was a broken thing that happened to be shaped like a carriage. He looked at the empty space where it had stood. I did. Need to fix it. I needed to decide I wasn't going to keep it in my carriage house as a monument to the worst night of my life. Nora looked at the swept floor. At the new harness. At the different carriage in the corner. Your father's verdict. She said quietly, yes. You're not arguing with it anymore. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not agreeing with it. He said. I don't think he'll ever be entirely finished with what happened on that road. But he paused. I've decided it doesn't get to be the only thing in the carriage house. The last light was fading from the sky. Inside the carriage house it was already dark. But not the old dark, just the ordinary dark of a working outbuilding at the end of an April day. Come inside, Nora said. Mrs. Pruitt will be waiting. Yes. They walked back to the house. Behind them, the new roses stood dark against the south wall of the east garden. The first buds closed for the night, waiting with the patience of things that have been carefully planted and are confident in the season. Above the garden the stars were coming out, one by one, in no particular hurry, inside Blackstone Hall. The lights were on in every room that needed them. This was not something that could have been said 5 months ago. It was something that could be said now, and tomorrow, and in all likelihood the morning after that. And Nora Hill, who had arrived at a locked gate in November with a traveling bag and a debt she had since discovered she didn't owe, walked through the front door of her own house and hung up her coat and went to find her husband. Because it was the end of a good day and there was no other place she needed to be.